Okay, so any questions before we jump back into a discussion of material? Remind you of something that I told you on Tuesday. This week, our class sessions, the lecture sessions, are going to be a little bit different in one respect than the rest of the semester, in that the material that we're covering in the lecture session corresponds pretty closely to what's in the reading material, those policy primers, part 1, 2, and 3. Now, that's really the exception to the rule. As we move to next week, week 3 and 4 and 5 and 6, and on through the end of the semester, that's not going to be the case. Okay? But at least here early on in the semester, you can kind of get some reinforcement one from the other. Maybe, for example, the quiz that you just took, you benefited a little bit because we had talked about the policy primer part 1, the information in the policy primer part 1 in Tuesday's class session. And then next week when you come in and take the reading quiz next Thursday, it'll be quizzing over the stuff in policy primer part 2 and part 3, which is really what we're going to be dealing with in class today. So, that's works to your advantage, I think, the way that this is set up for you guys. It doesn't work exactly the same way for the people in the online section. Okay, for those of you who are online, just if you'll raise your hand real quickly so that I'll know that you can hear me and see me right now. I'm about to take the camera view away. Okay, good. Thank you. All right, so let's jump back into the discussion that we're having on public policy. As I said, we spent the class meeting on Tuesday talking about what public policy is, the defining characteristics of public policy, and the systems model. All right? So any questions about any of that? You're going to get a lecture quiz next Tuesday on that, and for those of you online, that'll be Sunday, Monday. Okay? Any questions about any of the information that we covered last time on the characteristics of public policy and the systems model?
So the lecture quiz is only over Tuesday's lecture, or both?
The lecture quiz coming up on Tuesday, this coming Tuesday? No, it'll be whatever we covered in this week's classes. I hope I'm not confusing more than I'm clarifying. I'm trying to clarify a little bit. I worry that maybe I'm confusing you more than anything else. All I'm really trying to say is that when you come in and take that lecture quiz next week, and when you take the reading quiz next week, the lecture quiz obviously is going to be what we talked about this week, right? But then the reading quiz is going to be over the reading material for this week, which is policy primer part 2 and part 3, which corresponds with what we're talking about today in class, right? So there's a lot of overlap between the information that we're covering in the class session and the information in the reading material. Once we get to week 3, there's not nearly as much overlap. Okay, so let's start by talking about the production line model. And as I say here in the policy primer, what I'm really trying to get you to understand about policy making is that it is, because it's purposive or goal-oriented, which is what we talked about last time, we can think about the process of policy making as a series of activities undertaken in response to a problem or condition. It's essentially problem solving. And in that sense, it's really no different than any other set of problem solving activities. We have these labels that we put on each of the stages: agenda setting, formulation, adoption, / legitimation, implementation, and evaluation. But and there's a couple of ways that you can approach this material that we're covering here on public policy, particularly this production line model. You can approach it, one way that you can approach it, you can say, oh, here's some stuff I have to memorize for the reading quiz, or here's some stuff that I have to memorize for the lecture quiz, all right? And you can try to commit agenda setting and formulation and adoption, legitimation. You can try to commit all that to memory, What I'm really trying to encourage you to do is just think about it intuitively, in a common sense way, that it really involves the same basic activities that are involved in any set of problem solving activities, including the kind of process that you would go through in your personal life to address problems. So, as I mentioned in the primer, the first thing that has to happen in any problem solving process is what? What's the first thing that has to happen? You have to recognize that there's a problem, right? You can't respond to problems that you don't even recognize, that you can't see. And that's true in policy making as well. And we have a label that we put on that part of the process. We call that agenda setting. And I'm not going to go through in excruciating detail everything that I go through in the policy primer, but just to touch on a few highlights here, I also tell you in the primer that there's two sort of subset stages, or two distinctive sets of activities involved in agenda setting. You're nodding your head yes, Doreen. So are you just saying, yeah, I'm with you, or are you saying you know what they are?
Yeah, I'm with you.
Well, you tell us what they are. What are the two activities?
I'm with you. I just said I'm with you.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, so in agenda setting, there's two basic activities. Okay, problem identification and priority setting. Okay, problem identification, priority setting. But as I say here in the primer, when we use the term problem identification, it sounds like a very mechanical kind of thing. Like all you have to do is open your eyes and see that there's a problem. But in politics, it's really not. It's more nuanced than that, right? It's really not that straightforward. It's really more a matter of problem perception. And because the point is that the way that we perceive problems is different. The way that you perceive a problem is going to vary at least somewhat from the way that I perceive a problem versus the way that you perceive a problem and you perceive a problem and so on, right? We say problem identification in agenda setting, but it's really a matter of problem perception. The way that we perceive problems informs everything else. It informs certainly the kinds of policy responses that we're going to advocate or we're going to embrace in response to the problem. Okay? Have any of you seen the news reports here in the last couple of days about the mudslides in California? No, none of you keep track of the news, watch the news? Apparently they're having some pretty heavy rains and snows in parts of California. And
wait, really?
yes.
Snow in California?
Yes, it happens, particularly in the mountains, right?
Yeah.
At any rate, sometimes when they have a heavy volume of moisture that falls to the earth, they have what they call mudslides in California. And some of the pictures are pretty astounding. Like you'll see a river of mud coming down the side of a mountain or the side of a hill and just washing homes and cars and everything away. So we see, you got to pay attention to the news. So you're watching the news, you see these reports, you go, wow, they got some problems in California. But you can bet the way that you perceive that problem sitting here in such lovely January weather on the Texas Gulf Coast is quite different than the way that the people in California perceive that problem. Just like when we had Hurricane Harvey here, the way that they perceive that, oh, they've got some real problems there in Houston. Look, everything's underwater. We wonder, why do people build their houses in the sides of mountains anyway for the day that mudslides are going to come and wash it down, stream? And they're saying, why do they build their homes so close to the hurricane impact zone? Why do they build their homes in swamp? But you understand what I'm saying? Like in this particular example, if you're in Houston during Hurricane Harvey, you might be many times more ready to have government respond to that than the people who are sitting out in California. All right, right? Okay, so that's what I mean by it's a problem perception rather than just problem identification, right? Because at a minimum, problem perception is going to affect the policy responses that we are receptive to.
So the amount of people that it affects and the amount of people that have the perception that it needs to be fixed, that's.
I think you're generally on the right track. I would just caution you that it's not necessarily about the amount of people.
Okay.
Because what we're going to discover as we go along is that there are some policy issues, there are some problems that are identified that relatively few people perceive as a problem.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily a question about the numbers of people.
It's just, okay.
Well, you know, I think that point might become clear to you as we proceed.
Gotcha.
Okay?
Thank you.
All right, so we've got problem identification and problem perception. We got problem identification and priority setting. Now, that second point about priority setting is important because what do we mean by an agenda? An agenda in this context, I tell you what, generally speaking, what is it? What do we mean by an agenda?
Whatever is being discussed.
Whatever's being discussed, okay, that's pretty good.
Your agenda is your plan.
Okay, and do any of you like prepare a daily agenda?
Yeah.
You do? Okay. I used to do that, try to do that.
You just gotta know.
Things to do today,
Yeah.
right? I could never get past number one though, which is make a list of things to do today.
Today was get up and get here.
That's an agenda, sure, that's a personal agenda, okay? Have any of you ever attended a government meeting? Yes, one person?
What do you mean by government?
Well, like a school board meeting or a city council meeting or something like that, okay? They don't make you guys in high school do something like that anymore? Well, it's not so far-fetched to think that someday you might find yourself at a school board meeting. Maybe you'll have to have kids first or something, but you're at a school board meeting or you're at a a city council meeting or a commissioner's court meeting or something like that. They will actually have an agenda for the meeting, a document, right, where the it sort of dictates what the issues are that they're going to be discussing. And the first is the reading of the minutes from the previous meeting, right? Then there's old business and new business. It's all discussion of the plan to reopen after COVID. If we're talking about a school board meeting or something, whatever. Okay, so there'll be an actual document there, which is a meeting for that agenda. Now, when we talk about agenda setting and policy making, we're not really talking about that per se. I mean, we're really talking more generally about the concept of an agenda. So I think it's useful to distinguish between the concept of a public agenda and an official agenda, which, by the way, I do in the primer here. So I'm not going to go back through all that again. Okay. Public agenda is all of those problems that someone or some group of people have identified and they want government to address. Public agenda is all those problems that someone or some group of people have identified and they want government to address. The official agenda, by the way, sometimes that's also called the systemic agenda, the public agenda or the systemic agenda, depending on what textbook you're reading or what the literature is that you're looking at. It could use either one of those terms, right? So first we've got the public agenda, the systemic agenda, and then secondly we have the official agenda, sometimes known as the institutional agenda, right? So the official agenda or the institutional agenda are all those problems that government is taking up for consideration. Okay, everybody with me? So the public agenda, all those problems that someone or some group of people have identified and they want government to do something about. The system or the institutional agenda or the official agenda, all those problems that have been taken up by government for consideration. Now, one quick caveat here, maybe two. When we say official, it makes it sound very formal. And so, unlike this document that we're talking about is the agenda for the meeting, which is very formal. Can you imagine you're at this school board meeting or this city council meeting, whatever the case is, and there's this there's this printed document that they allow you to put your hands on and look at to follow along the course of the meeting, and you can actually check off, okay, they talked about that, they talked about that, they dealt with that, right? Public comment period, they did that, right? Do you think that those are the only issues that the members of the city council are immersed in at that juncture?
You always have.
Just the items that are listed on? No, of course not, right? That's why, I mean, you don't have to think about an agenda so formally as a document, okay? It's just the problems that the government is considering at that point in time. And then the other part is we say it in the singular. We say agenda, the official agenda, or the institutional agenda. But I want you to understand that there are many, 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 many agendas out there. Okay? Many, many official agendas out there. There's not just one official agenda. There are at least as many official agendas out there, or institutional agendas out there, as there are branches and levels and institutions of government in our system. And just to drive that point home, I'm going to share with you something that I think you probably already have some intuition about. Or the problems that are being addressed by what people like to call the federal government, the national government in Washington. Is that the same set of problems, identical set of problems that are being dealt with by the state government here in Texas? No, there may be some overlap, but it's not identical, right? And is it the same set of problems that's being addressed by the city of Sugar Land or the Fort Bend Independent School District? No, they have these different levels of government have different institutional agendas. But even if we just take one level of government, I know this is a course in Texas government, state and local government. Let's take the national, because I presume that, you know, coming into this class, most people are more familiar with what happens at the national level than at the state level. Either they've taken the federal government course, the 2305 course already, or whatever news and information they get tends to focus on the national level. Most of you are, yeah.
Oh, so you said different levels of government have what type of agenda?
Well, like the agenda of the national government, whatever problems the national government is dealing with at a given time is not the same set of problems that's being dealt with at the state level or at the local level. Okay? Now let's just take one of those levels of government. Let's take the national level. Right? Many of you are probably aware that in the national level of government, there are three branches of government. There's a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch, right? There's the Congress of the United States, there's the president, and there is the courts, right? Are the problems that on Congress's agenda always identical to the problems that's on the president's agenda? Of course not, right? There's maybe considerable overlap, but they're not identical, right? And are the problems that are on the president's agenda identical to the problems that are on the Supreme Court's agenda? Of course not, right? But even if we take just one of those branches of government, let's say Congress, again, many of you are probably aware that there are two chambers of Congress. There's something called the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate. And are the issues being addressed in the United States House of Representatives always at any given point identical to the issues in the United States Senate? They are not. And now if you want to take just one of those chambers, say the United States House of Representatives, and you learn that there are something like 27 permanent standing committees in the House of Representatives and scores of subcommittees, where one, for example, is called the House Ways and Means Committee, and another is called the House Foreign Relations Committee, and the other is called the House Armed Services Committee, and another one is called the House Banking and Finance, or whatever it's called, right? Or one's the House Agricultural Committee, and so on. They're not all dealing with the same issues, right? Okay?
But they're the guys that push for different
Yes, perhaps, right? But even if you just want to take it at the level of the individual member, okay? there are 435 members of the House of Representatives. And the agendas, the issues that concern each of these 435 members of the House of Representatives are not identical. The representative from the 22nd Congressional District here in the Sugar Land area, we have a brand new representative in the House of Representatives from this area. His name is Troy Nels.
Yep.
Are the issues that are on his agenda identical to the issues that are on the agenda of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez up from the Bronx, New York? Or where? No, she's from Brooklyn. Where's she from? Brooklyn? I don't remember. You guys know who AOC is, right? I mean, she's in the news enough that you are
Yeah.
the.
I see her way too much.
Well, I'm just trying to get a name that people might recognize, right? So is the representative from Texas, Troy Nels, is his agenda identical to the agenda of the representative from Brooklyn, Ms. Cortez? No, of course not. You understand? So the point I'm trying to make to you is that there are many, 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 many official agendas. There are at least as many agendas as there are levels of government, branches of government, agencies of government, chambers of institutions, and individuals who serve in those institutions, right? And one of the things that means is that there are many points of access through which individuals or groups of individuals can get government to pay attention to their problem. If you can't get one level of government to pay attention to your problem, maybe you can get another level. If you can't get one branch of government to pay attention, maybe you can get another branch. If you can't get one, agency, maybe you can get another, right? I mean, that's the point I'm trying to get at here is that when I say lots of points of access, lots of different agendas means lots of points of access. All right, so any questions about that? At any rate, so you've identified the problem. Now let's kind of go back to the intuitive problem-solving process like you might encounter in your daily life. You identify the problem, okay, and you make it a priority, right? I got to do something about this. What's the next thing? What's the next thing that happens in this problem-solving endeavor that you've undertaken?
You've already identified.
You've identified. You've looked at the mirror. You've looked at yourself in the mirror. And you said, "I have got to stop overeating. I got to lose some weight." Right? That's one that a lot of people. I sometimes find myself in that.
Yeah.
Right? So I've got to lose some weight, right? So what's the next thing you said? Okay, that's pretty good. That is certainly on the right track. I would say maybe say it just a little bit differently. You got to think of some possible ways of resolving that problem, right? Some alternatives. I can go on a strict diet. The keto diet, is that a diet? The keto diet. Okay. I can go on the keto diet. Okay. B, I can join a gym. Okay. C, I can do a combination of diet and gym. Let's just keep it that's simple. 3 options, right? You have to develop some alternative strategies for addressing this problem if you've made it a priority in the first step, right? We call the second stage when it comes to policy making, we call it formulation, policy formulation. By the way, this policy making process, as I'm laying it out here in the policy primer and here today in class, you may have noticed if you've read the handful of pages in the textbook, this is one of those areas I cautioned you about where the authors of the textbook talk about things at least a little bit differently than the way I talk about them. So just be aware of that. For example, in my version of the production line model, there are 5 steps or 5 stages. I think they have 4. 4? Okay, so you're going to come up with some alternatives. That's called formulation. And just like when we talk about policy making, just like agenda setting, when virtually anybody can be involved in these two stages of the policymaking process, both people inside of government and outside of government. But you can't skip over this stage. You can't skip over this step, at least as a logical matter. Sometimes in policymaking, there is really only one alternative that's ever given any serious consideration. That happens actually quite a bit in policymaking. Like an interest group identifies a problem, they go to their representative in Congress. Do you think that when they do that, they go and say, okay, Representative Nels, he's brand new, we'll pick on him a little bit, okay? The interest group lobbyist goes to Mr. Nels' office and they say, Mr. Nels, there's this issue here that we really think merits government attention and some sort of policy response. Do you think that when they go have that meeting with the representative or the senator or whoever the decision maker is, do you think that they just say, okay, we've got this problem now, what can you do to help us? Or do you think they go equipped with the solution as well? Yeah. We've got this problem here, here's how bad it is, and here's what we want you to do about it. Here's what we would like for you to do about it. That, of course, that's much more likely, isn't it? And so that's why I say oftentimes there's really only one alternative that's given any serious consideration. But just as a logical matter, there at least has to be two, right? Either that one or not that one, right? So in theory, there could be many alternatives, but in the reality of politics, sometimes it's not as many as you might think. Okay? All right, so that's formulation. Questions about formulation? So next is the adoption legitimation stage. You got these alternatives like, oh, I can join a gym, I can do the keto diet, or I can do both. Now what do you got to do?
You got to do it.
Well, but even before you do it, what do you have to do? Don't skip over this as a logical matter. Don't skip. You got to do what? You got to decide which one you're going to do. If you decide you're going to do a combination of diet and exercise, then that was the third alternative. I'm picking alternative 3. Right? Now, in the context of policymaking, that's called adoption. Adoption just means picking or choosing. From among the alternatives that were developed in the formulation stage, government decides which one. In this stage of the policymaking process, the actual act of adopting is the exclusive territory, domain, purview, prerogative, however you want to think of that, of government. I just told you a couple of minutes ago that in agenda setting and formulation, just about anybody can be involved. Anybody can identify problems, both inside and outside of government. Theoretically, anyone can really formulate alternatives inside or outside of government. But when it comes to this stage of the process, it's only government. Who remembers why? What's the key to our understanding this point here? And we've already talked about this point previously, both in lecture last week and in the policy primer in Tuesday's lecture.
Because you've given them the mandate to.
I'm sorry?
Because you've given them the mandate to formulate policies.
Okay. Yes. What else? Somebody else said something? There has to be some reason for you and me to believe that this policy binds our behavior, right? And government is the only institution in our society that is recognized as having that kind of authority. That's the concept of legitimation. And by the way, that's why I call this stage formulation / legitimation, whereas the authors of your textbook do not do that, okay? They just call it, I guess they just call it adoption. But I like to drive home the point that this is legitimizing the policy is essential. And certainly in a democratic political system, for people to believe that they are bound by that policy. Like I was saying previously, why do people pay their taxes? even though they don't like paying taxes. Well, because they believe that it's legitimate for government to tax them. They might not like how much government taxes them, but Americans believe as long as it's developed by government within the constitutional parameters that government operates rather than outside, we believe it's legitimate as a general rule. And I think it's most Americans. There obviously are people who are going to vigorously argue that point. Okay? There are people out there, including in recent news, who are challenging the legitimacy of the government, right? But that doesn't happen every day. As a news story, is what I'm saying. Okay? So adoption/legitimation. Now, once you've picked one, now what is next? You picked, I'm going to do a combination of gym and diet. What's the next thing? You actually have to go to the gym and you actually have to diet. You have to do it. Not enough just to decide to do it. You got to do it. The old Nike slogan, right? Just do it. Okay? And we've said previously that that's really the key to understanding what the substance of policy is, right? Right? When we started this discussion, we said that sometimes government decides one thing and then does something else. It's really the doing it that informs us about what the policy actually is. So we call that implementation. In this model, we call that stage implementation. Okay, and there's a lot of supporting information here about implementation, and I really, don't use this class discussion that we're having here this week on these policy primers as a pass, as a permit, a hall pass. Do they still do hall passes in the school? As a hall pass on reading the policy primer, because there's quite a bit of important information here, supporting important information in the primer that I'm just sort of glossing over in class.
But we could do it vice versa, actually, right?
Do what vice versa?
We could go over, read this whole thing before the lecture.
Well, believe me, when I was setting up the class, I considered having you take the reading quiz for the reading assignment for week 1 in week 1. That way you would have read it before we came in and talked about it in class, right? There's lots of arguments, I guess, probably in doing it either way, but in the end I decided to do it this way. At least this way, maybe you'll have a little bit more of a comfort level with the specific information that's provided in the primer. Okay, once we have some implementation, the next stage or the next step. Okay, you've been working out in the gym for a while, and you've been doing I've been doing the gym for a while. I've been doing the keto diet for a while. What's the next thing?
Reap the benefits.
Well, maybe. I've got to assess whether I'm achieving what I thought I was going to achieve, right? That's called evaluation. I'm going to evaluate or assess the results that I'm getting or not getting, right? And one would think if I'm not getting the weight loss that I think I should be getting, then I might do what? Maybe I modify it some. I tinker with the plan some, or maybe I just scrap that all together and go to something else. Right? So the concept here that we're talking about in the policymaking process in this production line model is called evaluation. The measurement of policy performance and consequences in terms of policy goals and other standards. And again, you can have just about anybody involved in policy evaluation. Sometimes, and I make this point in the primer here, so I'm not going to elaborate, but I would tell you in politics, because remember this policymaking process is thoroughly political, right? Oftentimes in politics, it's informal policy evaluations more so than the formal or scientific evaluations that inform further policymaking more so, right? The informal stuff, the kind of snap judgments that people oftentimes make based on anecdotal evidence or whatever, even maybe not even that much evidence. Maybe it's just that it's because that's what they believe. Maybe based on their ideological standpoint, right? They make evaluations of this policy or that policy. That oftentimes is more important as the policymaking process proceeds than the formal scientific analysis where people are actually analyzing data and looking at numbers, right? Actually quantifying things and so on. For many, many years in the debate over public assistance programs, people used to argue that people get on welfare, as most people like to call it welfare. I don't really like that term welfare very much for a number of reasons, but I prefer the term public assistance. But people get poverty relief programs, right? People get on welfare and they just stay on it indefinitely. They stay on it year after year after year after year. That is probably still today a very widely held view by many Americans, even though the data suggests otherwise and has for a long, long time suggested otherwise. That the average dependency period for a program like the old AFDC program, for example, now it's called Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, is less than 2 years. But you wouldn't believe that based on the stories people tell. Or that, people on food stamps, it's not called food stamps anymore, it's called SNAP, right? That people on food stamps or SNAP, abuse the program by buying things or, using these food coupons. They used to actually issue coupons. Now it's done electronically, but using it fraudulently, even though the data tells us that fraud in that program was exceedingly limited, very limited. You understand what I'm saying? Oftentimes in politics, as I like to say, in politics, perception is 99% of reality. 99% of reality. What people perceive oftentimes is more important than what actually is. And we see that in virtually every area of policymaking. I think in some areas it's more conspicuous than in other areas. Like, I think it's really conspicuous in public assistance programs, but there are all kinds of areas where we could talk about, where I think that holds true. Okay. Any questions about the policymaking process? There's some, look, just to really drive home the point that I was making to you a moment ago about you need to read the policy primer rather than relying on what I've said here in class. For example, back up here under the adoption legitimation stage, there's some information here about different types of policy statements. One of the things that happens in the adoption stage is that a policy statement is produced. And what I've done here is to outline several of the different types of policy statements. Didn't talk about that in class.
I was just saying, I kind of got lost on implementation. I could go through here and get some notes off of here.
Well, I'm happy to answer questions if you have them. What questions do you have?
Well, nothing. It was just I kind of got stuck. But in implementation, so I guess between 4 and 5. So after it's been implemented into society, they use all 3 of the policy think tanks, news media, and just regular people.
Well, all I'm saying there is that those are possibilities. They don't necessarily, apply in every policy scenario. But oftentimes, policy evaluations can be conducted by so-called policy think tanks. Okay, these are, organizations that, like the Center for Public Policy Priorities, that conducts formal scientific analyses, or the Urban Institute, or the Cato Institute, or something like that. These are non-profit, generally speaking, non-profit organizations, and they monitor public policy, and they review public policy, and they issue reports on, such things. That's what I'm talking about there. The news media can do it, right? The popular news media, a newspaper, the New York Times, or the Houston Chronicle, or something like that, depending on what the policy is that we're talking about. Maybe, for example, the Houston Chronicle does a series of stories on the vaccine rollout in Houston. And they're commenting on how inefficient it appears to be. That's a policy evaluation. But it's just individuals, people like you and me, right? We can do policy evaluation too. And oftentimes, as I said, that's more important than the formal stuff.
I canvassed for Mr. Meals. Was I doing that? I was asking people if they were going to vote for it.
Were you doing what?
Was I like getting an evaluation?
Oh, I don't know what your conversations were like with people. There may have been some things that you discussed, but I doubt in general, the general activity that you were undertaking, we would put under that heading. Okay. Okay. Anything else you want to ask about here? All right, let's turn our attention then to part 3, which is a discussion of the 5 classes of public policy. And again, this part of the policy primer is not as, it's a little bit, I was trying to say it's brief. I guess it is somewhat not as lengthy as the other two, but what I'm really trying to get us to think about here is that there are several different types of activities that government undertakes. Since we're associating the substance of public policy very closely with what government does, the implementation of public policy, right? Can be a difference between what government decides to do and what government actually does. This policy classification scheme, I think, is useful because it focuses our attention on what government actually does. A classification scheme in general, whether it is in the study of public policy or the study of biological organisms or in the study of cloud formations or weather patterns or minerals or whatever it is, in any scientific enterprise, what does a classification scheme do for us? Well, it allows us to make comparisons among individual specimens, let's say, if we can consider a policy a specimen, right? Comparisons and contrasts, right? We can derive some general notions about how this type of policy or this class of the thing is different than this class or is the same, etc. Okay? It's no different in the study of public policy. It brings some order to our thinking about public policy. You all are looking at me kind of weird. For example, let's say this is a biology class, okay? And I'm a biology professor. Oh, wait a minute, I'm not wearing Birkenstocks and short pants. I can't be a biology professor. let's say I'm a biology professor, and I come in and say, okay, today, class, nobody be alarmed. No sudden movements. We don't want to alarm or, cause any problems. But we have with us today in the back of the classroom a specimen. It's a primate. Without even turning and looking, based on your knowledge of that classification of animal organisms, you can begin to tell me some of its characteristics, right? This is not a biology class, but just to drive the point home, somebody tell me one of the characteristics of a primate as I do my Bill Clinton invitation. No, that's too long ago. Bill Clinton doesn't mean anything to anybody anymore, right? I'm giving you a heavy hint here. Opposable thumb, right? One of the characteristics of a primate is it has opposable thumbs, which I'm no biologist, but I think many biologists would argue that little feature right there is what has allowed primates to achieve the top of the animal kingdom, right? Think about this for a second, right? This, for those of you who are online, you can't see, okay? So let me help you out here. So this little thing right here, this opposable thumb, is apparently a pretty big deal in evolutionary biology. They tell us that that's what makes primates kings, or at the top of the kingdom. And I'm gonna say, as far as I can tell, I agree with that to a certain extent, right? Who am I to disagree? First of all, but in other words, what they're saying is, look, this little thing allows us to pick up one of these and develop written language, or to fashion tools and build things, or weapons to defend ourselves or even be aggressive, right? Or as the old ad campaign from Taco Bell used to say, enjoy Nacho Supreme. You all remember that advertising campaign? I guess it's been too long ago. Taco Bell was one of the most clever advertising campaigns I can recall in recent years. They would show pictures, still photos of various people enjoying their Nacho Supreme. A group of firefighters at the fire station, a group of college students in their dormitory, all with very happy faces enjoying their Nacho Supreme. A family sitting around a table, right? And they attributed this privilege of enjoying the Nacho Supreme to this opposable thumb. And then they would show a picture of a zebra and say, this guy gets no Nacho Supreme. Try picking up a Nacho Supreme with a hoof on the end. Anyway, I digress. Okay? My point, the broad point here is that just by knowing some of the general characteristics of a primate, you can tell me something about the specimen that you haven't even turned around and looked at yet. So in very much the same way, if you know some of the general characteristics, did I close my file? In very much the same way, if you, it was on bear with me here for just a second. Okay. If you know some of the general characteristics of each of these 5 policy types, that actually is pretty powerful in terms of how well you understand specific policies. Okay? So the 5 types of public policy, or the 5 classes of public policy that we see in this scheme, are resource allocative, resource extractive, regulatory, symbolic, internal organization, and management. And in order to classify policy under this scheme, you have to be able to identify 2 things: the who and the what. Who is the primary target group? And what is government doing to the primary target group, or for the primary target group, or with respect to the primary target group? So if you have, by the way, a target group, a primary target group is just the segment of the population. We're always talking about people here. Government makes policy with respect to people. So if the segment of the population that we're talking about that is directly affected by the policy rather than indirectly, okay, that's the primary target group, which implies, by the way, if we say primary target group, that there are secondary or tertiary target groups as well, or could be, okay? We're interested in the primary target group. We only have to know what the primary target group is, okay? So if government is giving to that primary target group, or benefiting, aiding, subsidizing, that's called resource allocated. Government is allocating resources to the primary target group. So we were briefly talking in the previous class meeting about Social Security. I told you that Social Security, what most people call Social Security, is actually a program called OASDI, Old Age Survivors and Disability Insurance. That program, the primary target groups are identified for you right there in the title of the program. Old age, the elderly, survivors. What's a survivor in this context? Like a widow or a widower, or the children of, where the parent has died, right? Receive benefits under that program, right? What is government disability? That's pretty straightforward, right? And so what is government doing with respect to these primary target groups? Oh, it's giving, it's benefiting, it's aiding, it's subsidizing. That's resource allocator policy. Now, government can give to all kinds of target groups. It's not just, don't make the mistake, as I've discovered over the years that many students seem to make, in assuming that when we talk about resource allocator policy, we're talking about public assistance or welfare programs. Because government can give to the poor, okay, but there are lots of other primary target groups that government can give to as well. How many of you received an economic stimulus check? Okay? So the primary target group there, for all practical purposes, is everyone, like the entire American public. That's a big primary target group, right? And what's government doing? It's giving, it's benefiting, it's aiding, it's subsidizing. If government can give to primary target groups, then it must also be able to, in fact, out of necessity, must do what? Take. Right? So if we have a primary target group, and what government is doing is taking from that target group, then we have resource extractive. The most obvious example of a resource extractive policy is a tax of any kind. Federal income tax. Who's the primary target group? People who make income, who generate income, right? The government is taking some of that income, right? Sales tax in Texas. Who's the primary target group? That one's a little bit more complicated, but most people are going to assume that it is consumers who, when they buy, make purchases, right? It's a little bit more complicated than that, but for our purposes now, we'll just leave it at that. Okay. It's actually the businesses that make retail sales. Government can take money as a resource, right, in the form of taxes, but it can also take other kinds of resources like time and service. Okay. I think that's a good one. We don't have a draft, and we haven't had a draft in this country, a military draft, for a long time. But I suppose if you could go back to the 1960s, the 1970s, during the Vietnam War, and ask young men who were subject to the draft, hoping that their lottery number wouldn't come up, right? Hey, what do you think government is taking something from you? Here, I bet they would say, you bet they're taking something from me. They're taking 2 years of my life is what they're taking from me, and maybe my life itself.
Well, not as extreme as that, but jury duty.
Sure, I like that one. That's a good example. Government saying to you when they call your, you get that notification for jury duty. They're saying, we're going to require a little bit of time and a little bit of service from you.
Have you done jury duty?
Oh, many, many times. Sure. Have you? Oh, well, your time is coming at some point. You'll get.
I've heard some crazy stories though.
By the way, the fact that most people try everything they can to get out of it is an indication that people perceive government as taking something from them. It's not like when they get that Social Security check. I've never heard of anybody who gets their Social Security check saying, I wish government would stop sending me this money. I'm so sick. By the way, in the systems model, we didn't talk about it in class last time, but you may remember from looking at the diagram, it indicates policy outputs are perceived as either benefits or deprivations. That's exactly what I'm talking about, right? All right, if we have a primary target group and what government is doing is attempting to control their behavior, we have regulatory policy. And usually that's done by setting some standard for behavior and then inspecting for compliance. And where they don't find compliance, they impose a punishment. So things like traffic laws would be regulatory policies. Anything under the heading of criminal law would be regulatory policy. But there are also some specific regulatory policies that affect businesses, for example, the people who operate businesses. So again, read the policy primer. Okay, now in the interest of time, what I want to do, I'm going to let you pick up on the last two.
I was trying to read the symbolic.
I'm sorry?
Got lost.
Yeah, I mean, it's in the policy primer here, so you can pick it up there. Pick that up on there. We don't have a whole lot of time left. I want to use the last couple of minutes that we have here to share something with you, because I want to see if we can kind of put our knowledge to some use here. So I forgot to open this. Give me just a second. I got to find where I put it.
Oh, we have the discussion post tomorrow, correct?
Your discussion board opens tomorrow, yes, at midnight. Tonight at midnight. Oh, shoot, where did I put this? Here we go. All right, I want to share with you several stories here. And I want you to just kind of think about the information that's provided in these stories and try to put it in the terms that we've discussed about policy in these concepts that are introduced in the policy problem. Okay, so this first story is called "Federal Judge Blocks Labor Department Overtime Pay Order," and we're actually going to listen to the audio. This was a report that was aired on National Public Radio back on November 16th, 2016. Let's have. Okay, so what happened here in this, gave rise to this story, was that the Obama administration noticed that the story was 2016, okay? The Obama administration in the final months passed a rule, the Labor Department passed a rule that raised the level of pay for businesses to classify someone as exempt. You know what I mean by exempt or non-exempt? So if a person is an exempt employee, the employer doesn't have to pay them time and a half for overtime. They just pay them a straight salary, right? So the Obama administration is saying, well, we're going to raise that minimum level to $47,500, okay, so that people who are making a little bit more money, certainly more money than the $23,660, can be paid time and a half overtime. Okay, the story indicated that a federal judge stepped in and said, no, you're not going to do that. Now, subsequent to that, President Trump was elected, and the Trump executive order reconsidered that 47.5 figure, and eventually by 2019, they had revised the rule to 35.3. Okay, so they're raising it a little bit, but not as much as the Obama administration was. Okay, now there's a story here. Unfortunately, we don't have time to listen to it, but basically what they're talking about is the pros and cons of the Trump rule. Okay, and who benefits from it and who doesn't benefit from it, and so on. Okay, now, as you know, Biden inaugurated just a couple of weeks ago, has been signing a flurry of executive orders.
Like 19 the first week.
Like 19 the first. Trump did the same thing, by the way. In just the first week or so of the Trump presidency, he signed a whole bunch of executive orders reversing Obama administration policies. And now the shoe's on the other foot, so to speak. Now Biden's president, he's signing a bunch of executive orders reversing Trump administration policies.
Like sign.
Yeah. So the question is, he hasn't dealt with this one, but it's on the agenda, right? And it's just a matter of days before he does sign an executive order. And the speculation is that it will raise, I put 23.6 here, but it should actually say 35.3. It'll raise that 35.3. Will it raise it to the original 47.5 that the Obama administration had done, or will it be some other amount? Okay, so what I would like you to do is think about this issue, okay, in terms of the concepts that have been introduced, not only the characteristics of public policy and the systems model, but the stages of policymaking, the production line model, and now most recently the classes of public policy. Okay, and you might get a question or two on lecture quiz next week, dealing with this specific issue as it relates to those public policy concepts. Okay, all right, we'll see you on Tuesday. Have a nice weekend.